In this video I am going to photograph the magical and epic Svalbard with my Sony A7r5, the older A7r3 and a couple of lenses. Alright, so I'll just cover a little bit of the gear that I'm shooting with here in Svalbard. It's mainly going to be my A7r5 from Sony with the Tamron 50 to 400 mm on, or the 16 to 35 mm. As my secondary camera, I have my old Sony A7r3, and as you can see right now, the 16 to 35 is attached to that one. I may switch the lenses around as we go along on this trip, dependent on what I expect to be the main focus of whatever Zodiac outing we are going to do. For the 50 to 400 mm lens, I have taken off the lens color because it's just going to be in the way when I'm out photographing. And as you can see here, I also have a polarizing filter on. It makes quite a significant difference when I'm out shooting around water. I also brought the 28 to 200 mm lens. From time to time, I'm probably going to switch to that because it's just so light and easy to carry around. And it is very important to have your straps on you when you are out in the Zodiacs, because if not, there's a risk you drop your camera in the water, and that would be a shame. So we have come to this location called Hvitøya, and there's full of guillemots flying around here. It was quite a highlight last year. I did feature it in last year's video, but the difference is that this year we're here in the morning and there's like this beautiful layer of fog that we can hopefully benefit from when we get down into the Zodiacs. I'm mainly going to shoot with the Tamron 28 to 200 mm in fully manual, but with auto ISO. So in that way I can lock down my aperture and just close it down a little bit, and if I want a little bit deeper depth of field, I can just close it down even more, and then I can control my shutter speed too. And if I want to make some B-roll with this camera, I can always just like decrease the shutter speed and the ISO should drop down too. Now it is birds we're going to mainly photograph, so it's important to have a fast shutter speed. So we are talking like 1/1000th of a second, maybe even more. From the ship where I'm standing right here, it is possible to get some beautiful minimalist shots of just the completely blank sea, and then some of the birds either flying just above or being down, or whenever a bird just flies past the ship, I can just use a fast shutter speed to capture that bird in flight. However, I am certain that it is much more interesting to actually get down into the Zodiacs and get closer to the cliffs. Even for a landscape photographer, Hvitøya is one of the most fascinating locations in Svalbard. There is an estimated 60,000 pairs of guillemots on these cliffs. Each pair hatch only one egg per breeding season, and they take turns in finding food. As you can see on this video, the air is just full of them. They almost look like insects. For all photographers, it's just super addictive trying to photograph the birds in flight and trying to capture them in different interesting positions. For me as a landscape photographer, we were quite lucky to also have this beautiful soft atmosphere and fog hitting the cliffs, which in combination with the birds made for some fascinating photos. I also made this photo taking several vertical photos with the wide-angle lens and merging them into a giant panorama. However, of all the many photos I got around Hvitøya, I think my favorite is this super minimal photo of a guillemot taking off. This is also a great example of breaking the rule of space, which is a compositional rule that states that whatever subject in your frame with a perceivable front ought to be pointing or moving into the frame and not out of the frame. So technically this bird ought to be on the left side of the middle of the photo, and in that way it would be flying into the photo. However, doing so you don't get the splashes in the water. This is also why I prefer to call them tools of composition rather than rules, as there are plenty of occasions where you break said rules. If you want to learn more about composition, be sure to get my 2 ebooks. They're super easy to read with minimal text and tons of examples as to get to the point fast. There are links to both the full and free light versions down in the description of the video. So settings wise for wildlife photography, my philosophy is to have a somewhat fast shutter speed, let's say 1/1000th of a second. Then I'm going to stop down my aperture a little bit because the 50 to 400 millimeter, it does suffer from quite severe vignetting. And then I'm going to have auto ISO, so that will just like jump up and down. I may vary the shutter speed a little bit dependent on what I'm photographing. Obviously, if I'm using it for zooming in on landscapes, I can get away with a slower shutter speed, so theoretically a lower ISO. But I'm going to stop down the aperture probably a little bit more for those shots, unless it's some distant mountains. Because as a rule of thumb, I generally want to have as much in focus when I'm shooting landscape photography. The Sony A7r5 is also really good when it comes to focusing. I have it on continuous focusing, continuous shooting, and then I focus wide and let the camera find or search out whatever animal is in the scene. You can simply just put on animal detection for focusing. For the classic wide angle shot using the 16 to 35 millimeter, I'm generally going to be in aperture priority or again manual. I want to stop down so that I can get the entire shot in focus. So f13-ish, hopefully not further down with this lens because then a lot of diffraction starts to creep in. But since I am in movement and I'm going to be on a Zodiac, therefore I also have to prioritize a somewhat fast shutter speed, which means that I from time to time will have to up the ISO more so than if I was just photographing on a calm morning in Denmark. For focusing a landscape photo, I'm simply just going to use flexible spot, and then I will use the joystick to put the spot where I want to focus in whatever scene I'm photographing. But I will somewhat try to hit the hyperfocal distance or just focus on the background. So, some excitement. We have now arrived at Hvitøya, the White Island. And you can see it right here in the back of me. Now, on this small screen, it doesn't look super fascinating, but this here is like one big glacier dome. It looks super fascinating. There is like one place where the glacier is like falling off into the water, but the rest of the island just has this big dome on top of it. Now we are going to jump into the Zodiacs and get closer to it. The expedition leader has decided that it's only going to be a Zodiac cruise and not a landing because they have already scouted several polar bears and walruses, and we don't want to disturb the wildlife and bring ourselves and the polar bears in danger. However, already here from the ship, it just looks fascinating, taking the long lens, zooming in. I'm also trying with some panoramas. However, I'm not sure that actually works because it is still quite a long island. It is so nice to finally be through a big bank of fog that we have just been sailing through for the past couple of days. Like, I love fog when it's in a forest, not when it obscures the big, beautiful vista views as I have here in the background. But let's jump into the Zodiacs and see what we'll get from there. Oh boy, were we treated to a feast of amazing photographic opportunities at Hvitøya. Not just one or two or three polar bears, but 4 at somewhat the same location. One thing that's extremely important for the guides and expedition leaders are that we keep our distance and don't disturb the wildlife. That's why we need to use telephoto lenses for both photography and videography. And even though I photograph with a 400mm focal length, I still need to crop my photos quite substantially. But doing so can give some beautiful moments like these. this Svalbard voyage was generally super generous with wildlife, and especially polar bears. We actually saw 10 polar bears throughout the entire trip. Not all equally interesting, but this encounter and another where we got a polar bear eating off a carcass of some sort were extra special. On that same day we saw both another huge bear, which we got a few photos of, but probably also the same bear eating the carcass walking on top of these cliffs, which delivered a photo I personally really like due to its minimalism and showing the context of the polar bear. At Hvitøya we also encountered a herd of walrus. I personally didn't really get some particularly interesting photos here, but on another foggy encounter where we photographed a pretty decent sized colony of walrus, most of us managed to get both some portraits and some more artsy minimalist photos of the colony. If you struggle with editing your photos, be sure to get my huge 30 videos post-processing course where I share all my techniques for beautiful photography. My general philosophy throughout the course is to give you the tools so you can develop your own style. Whether you use Lightroom or Camera Raw, which is the raw converter to Photoshop, it should be very easy to get started and bring your photos to that next level. There is a discount code for my YouTube subscribers along with a link down in the description of the video. However, back to Hvitøya where we also photographed the big ice dome from different angles, got a cool photo of some resting birds and moved closer to where the glacier was breaking off into the sea, and I filled the frame with the ice and got this abstract photo of the wall of ice with a few birds flying in front. Actually, on this trip I got a ton of abstract photos of ice. On several Zodiac cruises we passed by some absolutely stunning smaller icebergs with loads of dramatic and dynamic texture where you could just zoom in and film the frame with utterly fascinating patterns. So we are about 81.5 degrees north, and we have come up to where the edge of the sea ice is, as you can see here behind me. So sea ice is what melts and freezes throughout the year, and it's simply just frozen seawater, and it just looks beautiful, as you can see here behind me. So I'm mainly using the Sony A7r5 with the wide angle lens on and my polarizing filter. The good thing about the polarizing filter is it removes the glare from the water, so the eyes stands out much more. What I'm generally looking for shooting down here are like holes like this and patterns. It's a very abstract thing, and because we have all this mist right here, we don't have a horizon line, so everything just continues out into eternity. It looks super atmospheric. I absolutely love it. It's very addicting just standing here and photographing out and finding shapes and patterns. We are also quite lucky because on the one side we can just get like the fog into the distance, but on this side we actually have the sun peeking through, so we can also get a reflection of the sun and get more light. So settings wise it's a little bit easier photographing on this side of the ship, because then you can just shoot at ISO 100, f7.1-ish, wide angle lens, long way down there, so don't think about focus. That gives a fast shutter speed. As the ship is moving through the ice, we need to have a somewhat fast shutter speed, like 1/100th of a second or more. Especially if you're using a longer lens to just zoom into some of the patterns here, you need to be aware of your shutter speed. When I'm photographing patterns like this, compositionally what I'm thinking about is to do some edge patrol, make sure that I don't have like distracting elements along the edges of the frame. Then I think a lot about balance too, so I have a somewhat nice distribution of the visual elements throughout the scene. Both these things are something I cover in my ebooks on composition, and the link is of course down in the description. A cool feature about this ship is, as you can see people standing down here, is that we can like lower down these wings in front of the ship, so we have like an extra platform very close to the ground or the water that people can get to. Personally, I find that especially with big pieces of ice like this, I need to get a little bit more distance. So I'm further up on the ship, all the way up at deck 8 or 9 up here behind me. As mentioned, it's super addictive to photograph all these patches of sea ice, both wide and a bit more zoomed in. There are so many shapes and patterns to find and react to. As we joked about in the group, that after a day in a location like this, you can make an entire photo book about ice. Besides the abstract photos, I also got this one of a fog bow, actually what looks like a triple or quadruple fog bow. And when the guides went out scouting the area in the Zodiacs, they made for some great scale and focal points. So after a little Zodiac ride, we are now on sea ice. This is so cool! And there's even like a little pool here in the background, you can see there. We're photographing from different angles up towards the sun. Getting some really nice shots here. Just the experience is phenomenal. Absolutely different from anything I've tried before. More than 81 degrees north. Cool. Now, the keen eye may have noticed by now that I haven't shown a whole lot of classic landscape or vista photography, but here it comes. Throughout this voyage we made many Zodiac cruises, and whether we were close to glaciers or in mountainous areas, it was all about finding some interesting foregrounds and somehow lining them up with the background. Being on Zodiacs, you have to work really fast, and for those reasons it's quite sparse with the B-roll, as I had to prioritize getting the photos. But here is a collection of some of my favorite vista photos taken from the Zodiac. One place I think we all remember vividly was passing by this incredible cave in front of a glacier. For safety, we always kept a minimum of 400 meters to any glaciers, so although I may show some photos with Zodiacs in front of a glacier wall, there is actually a very long distance between the Zodiac and the glacier. It's all down to perspective compression. But this glacier cave was just epic, as we several times could see ice drop down from the ceiling and some birds flying around the opening. Oh! Some of the guides estimated that the cave ought to collapse within the next 24 hours. If you want to join myself, Nigel Danson, James Popsies and many more amazing professional photographers on a similar trip like this, actually even on the same ship, the Greg Mortimer, we've now released the Antarctica February 2026 workshop. It's going to be an absolutely incredible and for most people once-in-a-lifetime experience. Simply just use the link in the description of the video and go down to the bottom of the page and inquire about what kind of berth and the amount of people you want to travel with. If you're in doubt, just press whatever and tell Aurora Expeditions about your wants and needs. In that way, they make sure to give you the most optimal offer based on what you want. As mentioned, there is a link down in the description of the video. One of the things I find to be really great traveling and working with Aurora is that they are doing a lot of citizen science projects. So they go into the field and collect a lot of data for scientists in different universities.
We all want to make our best effort. We all want to make a positive impact. There are thousands of ways to do so. We are suggesting this as just one of them.
On top of that, when we go ashore with the larger groups here, we actually do some cleanup along the beaches. You will not believe the amount of garbage that comes ashore up here in such distant beaches as Svalbard. So those are some of the things that I really appreciate working with Aurora, that we not just give people an appreciation for Antarctic and the Arctic here in Svalbard, but also both support science and clean up the beaches. So we are on land. We have done surprisingly few landings, and that's because we have had surprisingly many polar bears. And obviously we are not going to land where there is a polar bear. Not because the fear of us being eaten, but because we have to shoot it if a polar bear shows up, and we don't want to do that. So we have landed here. There's some glacier stuff here, the ocean, and we have somewhat of a puffin colony up here, and we've also seen some reindeer. At this specific location we have a little bit of time to roam around free, so there's a perimeter of a Aurora guard down here in the background, and also over here, and within this area we can roam and basically do whatever we want photography wise. So showing scale in these big Arctic landscapes can actually be hard, and really showing how big it is. But with our Aurora guides standing out there, we can use them in the foreground as subjects. So they do add a little bit of scale to these big landscapes. And a subject, anchor point, focal point, or whatever you want to call it. So right now I'm shooting down there in this direction here, and it just looks super epic. I think it's Nicole we have down there along the water, walking and taking care of us that we don't get eaten by polar bears. So right now I'm actually only at like 80mm, but I'm also going to zoom in a little bit more to get a little bit more of a compression effect. So throughout this trip I've got a decent amount of these highly perspective compressed photos that really shows the scale of nature. It's so hard to see how big things are up here in the Arctic, but I really enjoy taking these photos because they really show how big this world is and how small we are. We finished off this magical day and the trip with a bit of wildlife photography from the zodiacs, where we among others saw some fighting birds and a small colony of puffins. Those puffins are so hard to photograph from a rocking zodiac, but I did manage to come away with a small collection that I really like. Be sure to check out all the links in the description of the video if you want to learn more about composition or editing, and if you want to join a voyage like this, join us in Antarctica in 2026. See you next time.